I thought my puppy was burying bones until the blanket started bleeding. Those were the exact words I shouted as I ran across the yard that morning, stumbling over a garden hose and nearly flattening my neighbor's tulips. You have to understand, our puppy Murphy had only been with us for a few weeks. Barely 10 pounds of floppy ears and tail-wagging joy. The kind of dog that chases his own tail, eats socks, and curls up in your lap like he's auditioning for a commercial. So when he started dragging his baby blue blanket out into the backyard every single morning, I thought it was a quirky little phase. Maybe he wanted to make a fort, or maybe he was just being a pup. Until that morning. The sun had just risen over the fence line, casting golden light over our dew-drenched lawn. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee when I saw him through the window, tugging the blanket across the grass with something oddly urgent in his movements. Normally, he stopped halfway to flop onto his back for a belly rub from the breeze. Not today. Today, he kept going. Focused. Determined. And when I stepped out to call him, I noticed something dark smearing the fabric. My heart dropped. I bolted across the yard, calling his name, but he just looked up at me, tail wagging, then sat beside the bundle like a guard. The closer I got, the more my stomach twisted. There, half hidden in the folds of that blanket, was something small, something red, something moving. I hesitated for a second, then dropped to my knees. It was a kitten, tiny, barely breathing, covered in grime and what looked like dried mud and little streaks of blood. Murphy nudged the kitten gently with his nose, then looked up at me as if to say, "Well, do something." I scooped it up, wrapped it tighter in the blanket, and ran back into the house. Murphy barked once and followed right on my heels. My husband Todd, who had just come down in his robe, stared wide-eyed as I rushed past him and laid the kitten on the kitchen counter. "What the? Kitten! Murphy found it. Bleeding. We need to get it help." He blinked, processing, then grabbed his keys without another word. Our vet, thankfully, only lived 3 blocks away. It was early, but I called ahead, and by some miracle, they were already there setting up for the day. We were waved in, and within moments the little kitten was being cradled by a tech and rushed to the back. Murphy waited in the front room, sitting so still you'd think he was the one in charge of the operation. Every time the door opened, his head would snap toward it. Every time a tech walked by, he'd wag his tail like he was checking on progress. We waited, and waited. Finally, Dr. Kerr came out, wiping her hands on a towel. "She's going to be okay," she said. "Bit dehydrated, malnourished, some shallow cuts and bruises, but no broken bones. We think she was abandoned." Murphy let out a soft bark, almost like a sigh. "Your dog may have saved her life," she added, crouching to pet him. "Good boy." I could have cried. We took her home that evening, after signing a few forms and getting some basic instructions. She was still weak, barely moving, but her eyes tracked Murphy like he was her big brother. He stayed by her side that night, lying on the floor next to the laundry basket we made into a temporary bed. The next few days were all about nursing her back to health, bottle feeding every few hours, warm cloth baths, visits to the vet. Murphy was part of every single moment, even licking her face after meals and whimpering if we took her out of sight for more than a minute. We started calling her Peanut. It didn't take long before Peanut was strong enough to start wobbling around the kitchen, swatting at Murphy's tail and climbing onto his back like he was her personal jungle gym. Murphy, patient as ever, just lay there and let her do it. Occasionally he'd get up and gently paw at her, as if reminding her he was still bigger. The whole neighborhood found out about it by the end of the week. News like that travels fast on our street. Our neighbor Janine came by with some old cat toys, and Bill from across the street dropped off a crate he wasn't using anymore. Even grumpy old Mr. Watkins next door left a little bowl of milk by the fence one morning. And then came the day Murphy dragged the blanket out again. This time, I followed him without saying a word. He took it to the same spot in the backyard, dropped it, then looked up at me. When I knelt down, he barked once, and then started sniffing around, circling the bush near the fence line. I bent low and peeked through the branches. There was another kitten. This one was gray and a little bigger, but just as scruffy and scared. Murphy didn't hesitate. He gently nudged it forward until it was close enough for me to reach. I picked it up and wrapped it in the blanket, shaking my head in disbelief. 2 kittens, same spot. A puppy dragging out a blanket every day like he was waiting for something. The thought hit me like a flash. Was he trying to find them all along? I had no answers, just questions. And something told me Murphy wasn't finished yet. "He's doing it again!" I barely had time to put my coffee down before Todd's voice echoed through the hallway, and I glanced out the kitchen window just in time to see Murphy gripping the corner of his baby blue blanket in his teeth, hauling it determinedly across the damp morning grass. His ears flopped with every step, and his tail wagged just slightly. Not out of playfulness, but purpose. I'd come to recognize the difference. Todd stepped into his boots by the back door, and I followed him out, both of us drawn like magnets to whatever mystery Murphy had picked up on this time. The gray kitten, whom we'd named Smokey, was already curled up with Peanut inside the crate by the fireplace. It had only been 4 days since Murphy brought Smokey into our lives, and in that time, they'd become inseparable. Peanut still followed Murphy around the house like a tiny shadow, and now Smokey followed her. The trio had formed a bond deeper than we could understand, and that bond seemed to be guiding Murphy toward something even bigger. He stopped at the exact same spot in the yard. It was a patch near the old rhododendron bush that lined the fence. He dropped the blanket, sniffed the air, then started circling the bush. His nose twitched, his ears perked. Then he barked, a sharp, short burst, before pawing at the base of the shrub. "Could there really be another?" Todd whispered. I knelt beside the bush, pushing branches aside, careful not to scare off whatever Murphy might have found. Sure enough, deep in the tangle of roots and mulch, a small shape huddled, trembling. This one wasn't a kitten. It was a rabbit. Or maybe a hare? Either way, it was young and clearly not well. Its fur was matted, its eyes half-lidded with fatigue. Murphy stood back and watched silently as I gently coaxed the creature out. It didn't resist, just blinked up at me slowly like it had given up on being scared. I wrapped it in the blanket and held it close to my chest. Todd exhaled hard, shaking his head. "We've got to get this one to Dr. Kerr, too." He was right. Within 15 minutes, we were in the car again, Murphy in the back seat, pacing nervously as we pulled into the parking lot of Kerr's clinic. This was starting to feel like a routine. Dr. Kerr examined the rabbit carefully, her brow furrowed. "It's a juvenile eastern cottontail," she said finally. "Malnourished and dehydrated, but it doesn't appear to be injured." "Is it normal for them to just be lying around like that?" Todd asked. "Not really. They tend to stay in nests or stay hidden if they're orphaned. This one looks like it's been exposed for too long." She looked at Murphy. "I don't know how your dog keeps finding them, but he's onto something. If there's a den or burrow nearby that's been disturbed, there might be more displaced animals." The rabbit, whom we later named Clover, stayed at the vet for monitoring, but the mood in our home shifted that day. There was a new energy, an unspoken alertness that came with each new morning. Murphy was on a mission, and now we were too. Over the next week, Murphy continued his daily treks with the blanket. Some mornings he came back empty-mouthed, just curling up next to the crate with Peanut and Smokey. Other mornings he led us to signs: torn bits of fur caught on branches, paw prints in the soil, even a broken piece of what looked like an old kennel door half buried in the woods behind the yard. It was there, by the woods, that the real story started to unfold. One morning, just as I was pouring oatmeal into bowls for the kittens, Murphy began barking in a tone I hadn't heard before. It wasn't alarm, and it wasn't excitement. It was persistent, like a signal. I followed the sound to the edge of the yard, where he stood still as a statue, staring toward the trees. "Show me," I said. He turned and trotted forward, pausing every few feet to make sure I was still behind him. We passed the fence gate, then moved along the worn path that cut through the thicket. About 20 yards in, Murphy stopped beside a low mound covered in leaves and sticks. I knelt down and brushed the foliage aside. There, partially buried under a sheet of plastic, was a small wooden crate, the kind used to transport pets. I yanked it free and pulled the door open. Inside was nothing but an old, torn blanket and the smell of decay. I coughed, backing away. Murphy sniffed it once, then started digging beside it. Within minutes, we uncovered a second crate, this one broken open and filled with old straw. There was a rusted collar buried at the bottom. My stomach churned. Todd arrived a few minutes later with gloves and trash bags. We spent the next 2 hours unearthing what looked like remnants of an abandoned animal drop site. Old cages, moldy food containers, bits of plastic dishes, a cracked water bottle. It was horrifying. "How could someone just leave them here?" I asked, angry tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know," Todd said quietly. "But Murphy's not letting them go unnoticed." We reported it to Animal Control that afternoon. They sent out an officer who walked the area with us and took photos. He confirmed it looked like an illegal dump site for unwanted pets, probably abandoned months ago, if not longer. "We get a few of these every year," he admitted, "but rarely with survivors. Your dog's done something incredible." Murphy sat proudly beside us as we spoke, licking Peanut's ears as if assuring her she was safe now. In the days that followed, Animal Control returned and helped us search further. They found signs of more recent animal presence, especially around the spot where Murphy kept leading us. One morning, with a soft whimper, he took us to a hidden nook beneath a fallen tree. Nestled there, barely visible unless you were really looking, was a trembling ball of fluff. This time, it was a tiny puppy, just skin and bones, shaking so hard it could barely stand. Murphy whined and licked its face gently until the pup opened one eye and let out the faintest yelp. We named him Biscuit. Our home started to fill, Peanut and Smokey, Clover the rabbit, and now Biscuit, who clung to Murphy like a child to its mother. Every mealtime became an event. Every nap turned into a cuddle pile. Murphy, still barely a full-grown dog himself, took it all in stride, guiding, guarding, and giving more of himself than I ever thought a dog could. We cleared out the old guest room and turned it into what the neighborhood started calling Murphy's Rescue Room. Todd built new shelves, we installed soft lighting, and I scoured thrift shops for pet beds, crates, and feeding bowls. Friends and neighbors dropped off supplies. Dr. Kerr donated a few bags of food. Even the local high school students asked if they could volunteer to help socialize the animals. And through it all, Murphy kept dragging that blanket. Every morning, like he wasn't finished yet, like he knew there were still more to be found. Murphy woke me up at 4 in the morning by dragging the blanket onto my face. That's how my day started, startled awake by the weight of a slobbery, dirt-streaked blanket flopped unceremoniously across my pillow. Todd groaned and rolled over while I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and looked down to see Murphy's anxious eyes locked on mine. His tail was still, his ears slightly back, and he was panting just a little. Not like he'd been running, but like he was trying to say, "Now, please." I slipped on a sweater, grabbed a flashlight, and followed him. No questions anymore. I trusted him more than I trusted half the people I knew. Outside, the air was still and cool, the kind of early morning hush that makes even birds hold their breath. Murphy headed straight toward the woods without hesitation. I held the flashlight low, watching the beam flicker across the dirt and roots. Murphy stayed close, only a few steps ahead, pausing every so often to glance back and make sure I hadn't gotten lost. He led me past the old crates, past the broken wire fence we'd found earlier, and into a clearing I didn't know existed. It was barely a few feet wide, encircled by trees, and the ground was uneven with what looked like burrows or dug-up soil. Murphy went straight to one of the mounds and started digging. Fast. Focused. I dropped to my knees beside him and started helping, even though I didn't know what we were digging for. Then I saw it. Wood again. Another crate. This one was deeper in the ground than the others, almost fully buried. The wood was damp and rotting, and the metal door was rusted shut. Murphy barked sharply once and began pawing at the edges while I pried the door open. My breath caught. Inside was a tiny ferret, curled up and unmoving. I reached in gently, pulled it out, and pressed it against my chest. It was breathing. Barely. Back home, I wrapped it in a warm towel and placed it on a heating pad we'd kept ready since Biscuit's rescue. Todd stumbled into the room, bleary-eyed, and I explained what happened between sips of reheated coffee. "This is getting bigger," he said. "Murphy's found 6 animals now. What if there's more out there?" That question lingered in the air like morning fog. We'd already contacted animal control several times, and they were now actively investigating the wooded area behind our home. But it wasn't enough. Murphy kept finding animals because he was looking in places people wouldn't even think to check. By noon, the ferret, who we named Popcorn, was awake and nibbling on a bit of softened fruit. Peanut and Smokey sat nearby, watching with wide eyes, while Biscuit stayed curled up next to Murphy, refusing to budge more than a few inches from his side. Murphy licked Popcorn's head gently, then sat up and gave me a look I knew too well. He wanted to go back out. This time, I didn't even grab a flashlight. It was bright outside, and Todd insisted on coming too. We packed water bottles, gloves, extra towels, and that same blanket Murphy kept using like a lifeline. The woods stretched out before us, quiet and deceptively calm. Murphy took us deeper this time, toward a part where the trees grew thicker and the canopy dimmed the light like a natural curtain. He sniffed around, circled a tall pine, and then stopped dead in his tracks. His ears perked. He barked once. A soft noise answered. We froze. It was a high-pitched whimper. Weak. Repeated. Murphy darted to the left, and we followed. Beneath a hollowed-out log, hidden beneath leaves and sticks, was a litter of 3 puppies. They couldn't have been more than a week old. Eyes shut, bellies round but cold to the touch. I scooped them up gently, one by one, and wrapped them in the blanket. Murphy hovered beside me, whimpering softly, licking the tiniest one, as if trying to warm it himself. "How many more?" I whispered. Back at the house, we set up a new space in the rescue room. Popcorn was now climbing the bars of her small crate, curious and surprisingly agile for a creature that had been nearly lifeless hours earlier. The kittens huddled in their bed while Biscuit stayed alert, occasionally nosing the newest arrivals to make sure they were still breathing. We named the pups Snap, Crackle, and Pop. Dr. Kerr visited that evening, checking each one and marveling again at Murphy's instinct. She called him a miracle, a rescuer with 4 paws and a nose for sorrow. By now, word had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local reporters reached out. A small crowd gathered one afternoon just to leave treats at our gate and write thank you notes for Murphy. Someone even made a little donation box and left it by our mailbox. Within 2 days, it was filled with envelopes. But Murphy didn't care about the attention. Every morning, he returned to the blanket. Every morning, he searched. On the 12th day since the first rescue, something changed. Murphy didn't just bark, he howled. It was long, drawn out, and filled with something that made every hair on my arm stand up. I ran out in my robe, heart racing. He was in the woods, tail stiff, nose pointed forward. I didn't speak, just followed. He led me past every familiar landmark until we arrived at a spot where the trees parted and revealed a broken chain-link fence. On the other side, scattered in the leaves and dirt, were the crumbling remains of an old structure. Wooden beams, rusted nails, pieces of plasterboard, a collapsed shed or outbuilding maybe, and in the middle, a narrow hole in the ground. Murphy barked, circled it once, then lay down beside it, pawing gently at the earth. I got on my stomach and peered in. Eyes stared back at me. Small, frightened, but alive. I scrambled to my feet and ran back for Todd, who grabbed the crowbar and shovels. It took us almost an hour to dig carefully enough to widen the opening without caving it in. Inside was a crate, and beside it, a fox kit. Just one. Thin and covered in soot, but alert. Murphy stepped back as we lifted it out. He didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, just watched, then turned and started walking home. We named the fox Ember. That night, I sat in the rescue room, surrounded by life. Peanut purred softly from her perch beside Smokey. Clover hopped lazily in his enclosure. Biscuit had claimed a blanket beside Popcorn's crate. Snap, Crackle, and Pop were curled up in a tiny puppy pile, and Ember lay swaddled beside a hot water bottle. And in the center of it all, Murphy. He yawned, stretched out on his side, and looked up at me like he was finally able to rest, for now. I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because that blanket, it was still waiting by the door. "We need to talk about the blanket." That's what Todd said to me one rainy afternoon, standing in the middle of our living room while Murphy gently nosed the same ragged square of baby blue fabric toward the door. It was stained now, soft from daily use, frayed at the corners where his teeth had tugged it so many times. If a dog could have a mission, this blanket was the banner he carried with him. Every morning he took it out, and every morning he came back with something that changed our lives. "I think it's like a signal," Todd continued. "Not just for us, but maybe for them. Like he's showing something safe, like he's leaving a sign." I hadn't thought of it that way before, but once he said it, it stuck. Murphy wasn't just searching. He was welcoming, calling, creating something bigger than we understood. We watched as he dragged the blanket to the porch and sat beside it, eyes scanning the trees through the drizzle. That day, he didn't leave the yard. Instead, he stayed by the blanket all afternoon, occasionally looking toward the woods, and letting out low, humming whines, as if he knew there was more out there, but couldn't reach them yet. Inside, the rescue room was busier than ever. Dr. Kerr had stopped by again, bringing extra supplies and checking on the now dozen animals that called our home their temporary haven. Peanut and Smokey were feistier by the day, chasing each other from one corner to the next. Biscuit had grown out of his frail frame and now barked whenever someone knocked on the door, like he'd appointed himself the household's official greeter. Clover liked to sneak under chairs and nap in the shadows, while Popcorn learned how to slide the latch on her crate open, to the amazement of every visitor who witnessed it. Snap, Crackle, and Pop had started eating on their own, tumbling over each other for the best spots at the bowl. Ember, the fox kit, was the quietest, but sharp. He watched everything with focused eyes, following Murphy's every move like a student learning from a teacher. And Murphy? He kept the same routine. Blanket, yard, watch, search. That night, around 10 o'clock p.m., he pawed at the door. "Now?" I asked, glancing at the clock. He pawed again. I bundled into a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and nodded for him to lead the way. The rain had stopped, but the grass was slick, and the air held that damp hush that feels like something important is about to happen. Murphy took me along the trail, but not toward the old crates. This time he veered left, toward the creek that bordered the far end of the woods. We hadn't explored this area much. It was hard to reach, full of brambles and uneven ground. I followed him across slippery stones, through a narrow path I didn't even realize existed, until we came to a large oak tree with twisted roots and a hollow near its base. Murphy barked once and stood still. I knelt down and aimed the flashlight into the hollow. My breath caught. A raccoon. But not just any raccoon. This one was tangled in a mess of plastic twine and fishing line. Its leg was caught, the skin raw and pinched. It growled softly, but didn't try to lunge or bite. It was too weak. Murphy sat a few feet away, watching silently. "Hey, little one," I said, kneeling closer. "We're gonna help you, okay?" It took time. Long, careful minutes with gloved hands and quiet reassurances. But eventually, I freed the creature and wrapped it gently in the blanket Murphy had carried with him. The raccoon didn't fight. It just rested, panting softly. We named her Sable. Back at home, we created a special enclosure near the window, away from the more energetic rescues. Murphy sat beside it most of the night, head resting on his paws, eyes never straying far from the bundle of fur he'd just saved. The next day, Dr. Kerr helped clean Sable's wound and said she'd make a full recovery. "Whatever instinct your dog has," she said, "it's almost emotional. It's like he's attuned to their pain." And maybe she was right. Days passed. The rescues kept healing. The routine held. Blanket. Watch. Wait. But Murphy didn't find another animal for almost a week. We started to think maybe, just maybe, he was done. Then came the night the Coyotes showed up. It started with barking, Biscuit and Smokey both alerting from the back door, Peanut hissing from under the couch. Murphy stood at the window, body stiff, tail raised. I looked outside and saw them. 3 shapes near the edge of the yard, lit faintly by the porch light. Coyotes. Lean, wild, eyes glowing. Murphy didn't bark. He growled, low and deep. Then, to my horror, he nudged the door open with his paw and stepped outside. I shouted, Todd ran for the leash. But Murphy didn't attack. He stood on the porch, tall and still, as the coyotes stared back. One of them took a step forward, then stopped. Another tilted its head, sniffing the air. And then, just like that, they turned and vanished into the trees. "What was that?" Todd whispered. "I don't know," I said. But Murphy didn't want to fight. He wanted to talk. The next morning, the blanket was gone. We searched the yard, the porch, the trees. Nothing. It was just gone. Murphy sat by the door, looking out like he was waiting for something. That afternoon, a woman from the shelter downtown came by to drop off donated crates. She introduced herself as Annie and said she'd heard about our rescues through the vet. As she walked through the room, meeting the animals one by one, her eyes filled with tears. "This is a sanctuary," she said. "You've made something beautiful here." I didn't feel like we had done anything extraordinary. We just followed a dog who refused to stop caring. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Murphy came bounding up from the woods, tail high, eyes wide, and dragging behind him, muddy and torn, was the baby blue blanket. Wrapped in it, nestled tightly against his chest, was a tiny opossum, no bigger than a baseball. It was breathing, just barely. We named him Button. "You won't believe what I found inside the laundry machine." That was the sentence that pulled Todd out of his chair, half a sandwich still in his hand, eyes wide with concern. It had been nearly a month since Murphy first started dragging that blanket around like a lifeline. At this point, nothing really surprised us anymore. Not the raccoon in the hollow tree, not the fox under the collapsed shed, not the trio of puppies by the creek. But this? I opened the lid of the laundry machine slowly and pointed, curled tightly in a damp towel, blinking up at me with a sleepy expression, and absolutely no understanding of how it got there, was Button. The opossum Murphy had rescued just days earlier. "I could have sworn he was asleep in his crate," I said. "Guess we'll have to lock the crate from now on," Todd murmured, gently scooping the sleepy little guy into his arms. Murphy, meanwhile, stood nearby with his signature calm expression, tail wagging lazily like he'd been the one to tuck Button in for a spin cycle nap. And for all we knew, maybe he had. Nothing seemed out of character for Murphy anymore. The house was full, no, overflowing, with animals at various stages of healing. Peanut and Smokey had evolved into full-on mischief makers, constantly knocking things off counters and pouncing on shadows. Biscuit had turned into a gentle giant, often seen napping with Ember curled up against his side. Popcorn, now a verified escape artist, had to be moved to a taller enclosure, and Clover was declared the quiet philosopher of the bunch, spending most of his time watching the others from his perch beside the window. Sable, the raccoon, was healing faster than expected, thanks to Murphy's constant attention. Snap, Crackle, and Pop were thriving, learning how to howl in imperfect harmony. And Button? Well, Button was now everyone's favorite mystery. How an opossum ended up tucked into a laundry towel was something we might never figure out. Dr. Kerr stopped by again that weekend. She brought paperwork for vaccinations and microchips, donations from her clinic, and 2 interns who had begged to meet the rescue dog with the blanket. Murphy sat proudly in the center of the room, while the interns snapped photos and offered him treats. He took one, then walked away to drop it in Popcorn's food bowl. That was Murphy, always thinking of the others first. But what made the day truly unusual was what happened that afternoon. Murphy didn't touch the blanket. It sat by the door, untouched. For the first time in weeks, he didn't so much as sniff it. He stayed inside, moving from animal to animal, checking on each one with a quiet, watchful presence. He nudged Peanut's chin, curled beside Biscuit for a moment, and even laid down next to Button's crate. But he didn't touch the blanket. "He's resting," Todd said. "He's done enough for now." But I wasn't so sure. That night, around midnight, I heard a strange noise. Not barking. Not whining. Something else. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. The rescue room was dark, save for the soft glow of the nightlight. Murphy wasn't there. I found him in the backyard. He was sitting beside the blanket, which he'd dragged out onto the porch. It was laid out flat, corners pinned with rocks, as though he were preparing something. He looked up at me, then back down at the yard. Then he howled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was long and low, carrying through the trees like a note held too long on a cello string. I stood there, barefoot in the cold grass, waiting. After a few minutes, the howling stopped. Murphy lay down on the blanket and stared out into the woods. The next morning, there were paw prints at the edge of the property. We checked the trail cameras we'd installed with help from animal control. Sure enough, there it was, just after 2:00 a.m., a young cat creeping toward the yard, stopping just before the fence, then vanishing into the bushes. She was scruffy, thin, with a torn ear and wary eyes. Murphy didn't chase. He didn't bark. He just watched. We left food out the next night. The cat came back. On the third night, she came all the way to the porch. Murphy waited by the door, tail still, ears relaxed. The cat sniffed the blanket, nibbled some kibble, then leapt away when she saw us. It took a week. By then, we were calling her Willow. She finally let us touch her on day 7. She let Murphy groom her on day 8. On day 9, she fell asleep inside the house, curled up on the blanket he'd laid out for her. Every new animal that came into our lives seemed drawn by some invisible force, and every time, that force had a name. Murphy. We had visitors almost every day now, kids wanting to meet the dog with the rescuer's heart, retirees bringing towels and food, teenagers organizing a fundraiser. A local news station even sent a crew to film a short segment called Murphy's Mission. Murphy tolerated the attention, but never sought it. The moment the camera crew left, he went straight back to Button's crate to make sure the little guy hadn't rolled out of his blanket. One morning, I caught him licking Ember's paw gently and carefully, while Biscuit stood guard beside them. It was so tender I had to step out of the room before the tears could rise too far. And still, every morning, the blanket would be waiting by the door. One evening, just before sundown, Murphy led us to the old stone well deep in the woods. We'd passed it before, but never paid it much attention. It was half covered by moss, unused, forgotten. But that day, Murphy circled it, sniffed the edge, and barked once. Todd and I exchanged glances. We peered inside. At first, nothing, just shadow. Then, movement. I grabbed the flashlight. Far below, huddled against the stones, was a pair of eyes. It took 2 hours, a harness from animal control, and more patience than I thought I had. But we got her out. A beagle puppy. Starved, scraped up, shaking. Murphy licked her face before we even made it back to the house. We named her Luna. The beagle puppy tried to climb into Murphy's water bowl. That was the first real moment we laughed in days. Luna, just skin and bones when we'd pulled her out of the well, had finally found her feet. She'd tried to sit in the bowl like it was a personal jacuzzi, splashing herself and anyone nearby with little kicks of her muddy paws. Biscuit yelped in protest as she got his ears wet. Murphy, of course, just stood beside her, wagging his tail like a proud big brother. It had been exactly 36 days since Murphy first dragged the blanket into the backyard. 36 days. 13 animals. And every single one had come through that old baby blue blanket like it was a portal to something softer, safer. We had no idea how Murphy chose the spots he did. Sometimes it was a hollow, sometimes a bush, once a creaky garden shed. But the results were always the same. Life where there might have been death. Warmth where there had only been cold. And lately, Murphy had started doing something new. He was teaching. It started with Ember. The little fox kit had grown sharper, stronger, more curious with each passing week. One morning, we watched through the window as Murphy led him through the yard, stopping every few feet to let Ember sniff a patch of grass or paw at a tree root. Then he'd bark once, circle back, and guide Ember to another spot. The next day, Biscuit joined them. By the third day, Peanut and Smokey were tagging along too, hopping and darting like small, furry satellites. It was like Murphy was holding classes out there in the backyard, teaching his little pack how to observe, how to listen, how to be gentle. It was mesmerizing. Dr. Kerr came by with more volunteers from the clinic. One of them, a wildlife rehabilitator named Mike, crouched beside Ember's crate and watched silently for a full minute. "He's leading," Mike said, "like a true alpha, but not in a dominant way, in a nurturing way. He's building something." That night, I found Murphy sitting beside the blanket again. This time, he wasn't waiting. He was watching the rescue room. Everyone was asleep, except for Willow, who sat near the window, staring out at the stars. Murphy padded over and nudged her gently with his nose. She blinked, turned, then followed him to the blanket. She sniffed it, looked up at him. Then, to my surprise, lay down on it. Murphy lay beside her. The next morning, Willow was gone. I panicked at first. We all did. We searched the house, the yard, the woods. No sign of her. Then, around lunchtime, she came trotting back from the woods, tail high, head lifted. And behind her? A tiny kitten barely the size of a mug, mewing with each step. We named her Tinsel. That night, Murphy let Willow curl up with him, draping a corner of the blanket over both of them. We didn't know what to make of it. Todd joked that Murphy was training successors. I wasn't so sure it was a joke. By the end of that week, Ember had led Clover to the edge of the woods and brought back a wounded bird, a sparrow with a broken wing. Clover had stood guard while Ember barked, drawing our attention. We named the bird Feather. It now lived in a small enclosure near the kitchen window, slowly regaining its strength. I started keeping a journal. Every morning, I'd write down what happened overnight. Who had visited the blanket? What had changed? Whether Murphy had gone out or one of his students had taken the lead. It was becoming harder and harder to explain it to people without sounding, well, a little nuts. But every time I doubted, Murphy gave me another reason not to. Then came the call. It was a man named Richard, a park ranger from a state forest 20 miles away. He'd heard about Murphy through a coworker who volunteered with Dr. Kerr. Apparently, there had been reports of abandoned animals turning up near one of the ranger stations. Not just one or two, more like 8 or 9 over the past 2 weeks. "I know this is a strange request," he said, "but do you think Murphy could come visit the site?" I looked at Todd, then at Murphy. "He'll know," I said. "If it's something he needs to do, he'll show us." We loaded up the truck the next day, Murphy riding shotgun with his blanket draped across the back seat. It was a cool morning. The drive took just under an hour, and Murphy didn't make a sound the entire way. When we arrived, Ranger Richard met us by the trailhead. 3 kittens, 2 puppies, a ferret, and believe it or not, a goat, he said, shaking his head. All in the last 14 days. We thought it was coincidence until the last one showed up wrapped in what looked like a piece of a blanket. Murphy jumped down from the truck and sniffed the air. He trotted forward, tail high, then paused by a worn path and barked once. We followed him. He led us down a steep incline, across a shallow stream, and into a small clearing filled with discarded cages. Empty. Rusted. The same kind we'd found weeks ago in our woods. Murphy sniffed one, then another, and finally sat down in front of a pile of leaves. I knelt and pushed the leaves aside. A squirrel. Injured. Shivering. Murphy had found it in seconds. We wrapped it in the blanket, gave our thanks to Ranger Richard, and headed home. We named the squirrel Maple. Murphy didn't seem tired that night. In fact, he seemed energized, like he'd found a thread he'd been waiting to tug on. I wondered just how many of these animals were connected. Was there a pattern, a root, a group behind it? Animal control started asking the same questions. We gave them everything, maps, dates, even Murphy's roots. But Murphy didn't need investigations. He had the blanket, and the next morning he was dragging it again. I didn't recognize the animal Murphy dragged in that morning. It wasn't a cat, dog, rabbit, or anything I'd seen in our woods before. It looked like a cross between a weasel and a fox, with long limbs and thick reddish fur, soaked from the night's rain. It was wrapped in the baby blue blanket, like every other rescue, eyes closed, body trembling. Murphy had placed it gently beside the fireplace, then stepped back, letting out a soft whine. Todd and I stared at it, unsure of what we were looking at. Dr. Kerr arrived 15 minutes later, and even she paused when she saw the creature. "It's a fisher," she said after a long moment. "A young one. They're rare around here. Mostly stay deep in the forests. How your dog found it, let alone convinced it to come, I have no idea." We named him Rusty. Rusty was frightened at first, prone to sudden lunges or scrambles for cover, but Murphy never flinched. He stayed close, quiet, and calm, letting the young fisher learn he wasn't a threat. By the 3rd day, Rusty was eating out of Murphy's bowl, though he'd dart away the moment we entered the room. Progress was slow, but it was progress. Murphy had long stopped surprising me, but that week, I felt something shift. It started with Ember. The little fox kit, now nearly full-sized, had become restless. He'd pace the yard, watching the fence line like he was waiting for something. Murphy would sit beside him, not stopping him, not guiding him, just watching. One morning, Ember didn't come back after his usual loop around the yard. We searched for hours, called for him, even left out food. Just before sunset, he returned. With him was another fox, an adult, bigger, wilder, and clearly wounded. Ember stayed close to it, brushing against its side as they limped toward the porch. Murphy met them halfway and led them inside. We didn't name the adult fox. We didn't need to. She stayed just 3 days, long enough for the bleeding to stop, the fever to ease, and then she left. Ember didn't go with her, but he walked her to the edge of the woods and watched until she disappeared. Murphy didn't interfere. He just sat beside Ember when it was over. That was when it hit me. Murphy wasn't just rescuing animals anymore. He was helping them rescue others. Even Button, the tiny opossum who had once mistaken a laundry towel for a bed, had begun exploring the house at night. We found him curled up next to Clover one morning, and later dragging a small piece of blanket toward the back door. He couldn't get it open, but the message was clear. They were learning from him, teaching each other, expanding the mission. And Murphy? Murphy was still the heart of it all, but he'd become more of a mentor than a solo rescuer. Each morning he'd sit by the blanket and wait. Sometimes he'd go out. Sometimes Ember or Willow or even Biscuit would nudge the blanket themselves and lead a small expedition around the property. By week's end, there were 3 more arrivals. A turtle, found in the middle of the road, shell cracked but alive. A hawk with a bent wing, unable to fly, discovered perched on the edge of our rain barrel. And a hedgehog, yes, a hedgehog, that somehow turned up in our shed, curled in a ball beside a half-eaten apple. We named them Pebble, Sky, and Pickle. The rescue room wasn't a room anymore. It had become the rescue wing. Todd knocked down the divider between the guest room and storage area, installed new lighting, and built custom enclosures. Volunteers came every afternoon. Neighbors brought food and bedding. A local carpenter donated wooden crates, and the animal control officer helped file the paperwork to turn our home into an official foster care satellite. It should have been overwhelming, but it wasn't. Murphy had set the tone. Calm, steady, focused on healing, not headlines. He only growled once, that entire month. It was the night we found the Coyote pup. She was small, her fur patchy, one eye swollen shut. Murphy had her wrapped in the blanket as usual, but something was different. His body was tense, his tail still. When I reached to help, he blocked me with his paw. "Murphy," I said softly, "it's okay." He didn't move. The coyote let out a sharp yelp. Murphy backed away. That's when I saw it, a tiny metal tag on the pup's leg. Not a microchip. A tag. We took pictures, sent them to Dr. Kerr. The next day, she returned with the animal control officer and a wildlife tracker named Joe. The tag belonged to a facility out of state, one under investigation for illegal breeding and animal trafficking. The pup had likely been released to cover their tracks. A throwaway. I looked at Murphy. He already knew. Joe took the pup to a rehabilitation center, but not before she knelt and placed her forehead gently against Murphy's. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. "You're doing what we should have done a long time ago." That night, Murphy slept with the blanket pulled over his nose, curled tighter than I'd ever seen. He'd carried the weight of so many lives, and even when others began to share the burden, he still carried it like it was his alone. The next morning, the blanket was gone. Again. But this time, so was Biscuit. Biscuit doesn't wander. That was the first thing I said when we realized he wasn't in the house. Todd had already done a lap through the rescue wing, calling his name, whistling, even shaking the treat container. Nothing. Murphy stood at the door, blanket in his mouth, tail perfectly still. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just stood there like he knew what was happening, and that we needed to move. We took the truck. Murphy led. No hesitation. We pulled out of the driveway and barely turned the corner when he barked once, pointed his nose toward the road that wound through the back part of the neighborhood, the one that eventually met the edge of the state preserve. It was early morning, and mist curled along the ditch line as we drove. The sun wasn't up yet. Murphy sat in the back seat, blanket under his paws, eyes locked on the tree line ahead. About a mile in, he started pawing at the window. Todd stopped the truck. Murphy jumped out and took off. We followed on foot, hearts pounding, trying to stay quiet. Murphy was fast, but he kept close enough for us to follow, weaving through brambles, jumping a fallen log, and stopping suddenly at a cluster of boulders. He barked once, short and sharp. Biscuit was there. Not alone. Beside him lay a raccoon, young, clearly injured, one paw twisted unnaturally. Biscuit stood protectively between the creature and the wild, glancing up at us as if to say, "What took you so long?" Murphy approached and dropped the blanket over the raccoon, nosing it gently. Biscuit sat down beside him, and the two of them waited. We named the raccoon Ash. Murphy and Biscuit walked home together that morning, side by side, heads held high. And when we got back, something changed. Biscuit began joining Murphy on his blanket rounds. Every morning. If Murphy picked it up, Biscuit was there, tail wagging, ready to go. It was clear Murphy had let him take a step forward in the mission, and Biscuit had proven he was ready. That week, 3 more animals came in, but not all were found by Murphy. Popcorn dragged a towel out to the yard one afternoon and sat beside the fence for nearly an hour before trotting back inside with a squirrel pup curled against her side. Clover guided us with quick hops to a shallow hole near the back garden where a tiny bird had fallen, wing fluttering uselessly. Even Tinsel, still barely bigger than a hand, was found cuddling a chipmunk kitten one morning. The chipmunk had been tucked into Murphy's blanket, but it was Tinsel who lay beside it, watching over it with wide, blinking eyes. Murphy didn't lead every rescue now, but every rescue still led back to him. He remained the center of the operation, the one every animal turned to when they weren't sure what to do. If there was tension in the room, a growl or scuffle, Murphy would step in, not with barking or force, but with presence. He would walk between them, sit calmly, and everything would settle. The news stories hadn't stopped. Neither had the emails, the visits, or the calls. One school invited us to bring Murphy in for a guest appearance, canine compassion in the community, they called it. We declined. Murphy wasn't a mascot. He was something else. And something was coming. We felt it. One night, just after the last volunteer had gone home, Murphy stood at the back door and whined. It was soft, short, but unmistakable. Todd opened the door, and Murphy bolted, blanket clenched tight in his teeth. We grabbed flashlights and ran after him. He led us farther than usual, past the woods, past the old stone well, past the fence line near the ranger station, into a part of the forest none of us had explored before. It was dark, the canopy thick overhead. We heard water, rushing, steady, a stream we hadn't mapped yet. Murphy stopped at the base of a tall, old tree with a hollow trunk. He dropped the blanket and sniffed the ground. Then he barked. Once, twice. We knelt and saw what he'd found. A fox den. Collapsed. Caved in. We started digging. It took us nearly an hour. Dirt flew, roots snapped, and sweat rolled down our backs. Murphy never left our side, digging when we paused, pushing when we hesitated. And finally, movement. 2 kits. One unmoving, one squirming weakly. Murphy licked the squirming one. Biscuit nosed the still one. And for a moment, the world held its breath. Then, the still kit sneezed. Both alive. We named them Cedar and Pine. That night, we didn't sleep, not from worry, but from awe, because when we returned home, something was different. The animals were waiting. All of them. in the rescue room, silent, watching. Murphy walked in with cedar and pine wrapped in the blanket. He placed them gently in the warming basket. Then he turned, walked to the center of the room, and lay down. Everyone came to him, one by one. Feather landed beside him. Popcorn curled at his tail. Clover tucked in against his shoulder. Ember lowered his head beside Biscuit. Even Button climbed over Willow to nestle at Murphy's side. The whole room gathered. And for the first time, it wasn't about a rescue. It was about being together. Murphy didn't move for 6 hours. That's how long he lay there in the center of the rescue wing, surrounded by his pack. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just rested. Awake. Still calm. Watching. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't sickness. It was something deeper. Like he was waiting for something only he could sense. The rest of the animals seemed to understand. None of them made a sound. Even the most excitable of the group, like Smokey or Pickle, curled up quietly in corners. Ember paced once or twice, but didn't leave the room. Biscuit lay near the door like a sentinel. And the blanket? Folded neatly beside Murphy's paws, untouched. The silence broke just before sunset. A knock at the front door. It was Jo, the wildlife tracker. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man in his 40s with a wiry build, sun-leathered skin, and sharp, intelligent eyes. He held his hat in his hands and shifted his weight from foot to foot. "This is Wyatt," Jo said. "He works with one of the field surveillance units that's been tracking illegal breeding operations in the county. He thinks he's found something, near the old quarry." Wyatt stepped forward. "We saw your dog in that news piece, the one about the blanket. I think he's been picking up trails from a drop zone we missed." Murphy, still resting on the floor, raised his head. "They used to move animals through backwoods crossings near the quarry," Wyatt continued. "There's still a network of broken-down kennels and covered pits out there. We've never found live animals before, but if your dog's been following some kind of scent path, we might be closer than we thought." Todd and I exchanged a glance. Murphy was already on his feet. We loaded into the truck at first light. Murphy sat between me and Wyatt in the front, blanket folded across his lap like a soldier's banner. Biscuit was in the back, eyes fixed on the road. The drive was long, winding through dirt roads and abandoned mining access paths. Trees closed in tight on either side. Eventually, the truck couldn't go any farther. We hiked the last stretch on foot. Murphy led the way. He didn't stop to sniff or circle. He moved like he knew exactly where he was going. After half a mile, he stopped. Barked once. Wyatt pushed aside a thicket of brambles, and there it was. A chain-link pen, nearly invisible beneath the vines. Inside were 3 cages. One was empty. One held a rusted food bowl. The third, a dog, skin clinging to bones, eyes open but lifeless. We moved fast. Todd cut the wire. Wyatt wrapped the dog in his jacket. I checked for movement, breath. There was some. Faint, but present. Murphy licked the dog's face once, gently, then turned away. But he wasn't done. He started walking again. We followed him through another 100 yards of forest, down a slope so steep we slid more than walked. At the base was an old drainage culvert. Just beyond it, another cage, this one newer. Locked. A raccoon. A possum, a fox. All alive. We called Jo. She brought carriers, supplies, reinforcements. Murphy didn't leave their side until each one was safe. The fox, red, older, missing part of one ear, refused to be separated from the raccoon. The possum hissed at everyone but Murphy. The dog, who we named Juniper, slept the entire ride home in the back seat, head resting on Biscuit's flank. Murphy stayed up the whole night. Not pacing, not restless, just walking room to room, checking on everyone like a parent counting heads before bed. The next morning, we received a call from the sheriff's office. Based on our reports and Murphy's discovery, they'd found evidence of 4 more active dump sites. They were coordinating with multiple counties to investigate. We turned the living room into a command center. Maps, pins, colored markers. Murphy watched it all, head tilted, as though absorbing the patterns. And that week, he found 2 more animals on his own, a barn owl with a clipped wing and a goat with a fractured leg. We named them Echo and Poppy. Echo perched on the bookshelf like royalty. Poppy refused to sleep unless she was surrounded by others. Clover took to sitting beside her for hours, as if offering company. We'd crossed 25 rescues now. Murphy had stopped dragging the blanket as much. Instead, he would sit beside it, nose pointed at the door, waiting to see who would come to him. Sometimes it was a volunteer, sometimes an animal, sometimes nobody. One morning, Feather flew in through the open window and landed on the blanket. She'd been released 3 days earlier. Now she was back, briefly, just to rest. Murphy sat beside her, then let her go again. The rescues weren't staying as long anymore. They were healing and returning to the world. But the blanket always remained, and Murphy always knew when it was needed. "There's a camera crew at the gate again." Todd said it with a sigh, peeking out through the curtains, while Murphy sat by the blanket, unbothered. It was happening more often now. Local reporters, students doing documentaries, even a podcast producer who offered to record an entire series just about the rescue dog with a sixth sense. But we knew the truth. Murphy wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for the next one who needed him. We politely turned them away. Not because we didn't want the story told, but because Murphy wasn't finished living it. That same morning, something strange happened. Murphy stood up, walked to the blanket, and began scratching at the floor beneath it. Not violently, carefully, repeatedly. He paused, looked at us, then scratched again. Todd got down on his hands and knees, lifted the rug beneath the blanket, and stared. There, set into the floor, was a narrow metal ring. "I didn't know there was a hatch here," he said. Neither did I. We pried it open, dust rising like a ghost. A crawl space, shallow, dry, lined with old wood, and at the far end, 2 tiny eyes. A kitten, no more than a few weeks old, thin and shaking. Murphy lay down and looked into the space, waiting. The kitten didn't move. I reached in, slowly, carefully. When I finally pulled it out, Murphy stood and licked its head once. We named her Acorn. No one knew how she got down there. We checked the walls, the vents, the baseboards. Nothing. But Acorn wasn't hurt. Just scared. She took to Murphy instantly, curling up beneath his front legs like she'd always belonged there. We thought maybe it would be a quiet week after that. It wasn't. Murphy resumed his patrols the very next day. This time, he headed west, toward the edge of the orchard we rarely visited. The trees were overgrown, wild. We hadn't pruned them in years, but Murphy moved like he'd mapped it all in his mind. He stopped at a fallen pear tree, barked once, and began to dig. Todd helped. Beneath the roots was an old metal box. Sealed. Heavy. We opened it with a crowbar, not knowing what to expect. Inside, blankets. Dozens. Torn. Moldy. Different colors. Each one, stamped in a corner, had a small number. And under them? Photographs. Notes. Scans of vet records. Printed sheets marked with names and dates. It was a catalog. Of animals. Dozens of them. All missing. Murphy nudged the box once, then turned and walked away. We took everything straight to Jo. She confirmed what we feared. It was evidence. The operation we'd thought was over was much bigger. Some of the animals listed were from as far as 2 counties away. Others had been missing for years. That box changed everything. Within a day, 2 more agencies got involved. Rangers, deputies, wildlife control. They set up checkpoints in the woods, posted signs, brought in drones. But Murphy still moved faster. The day after we found the box, he returned to the orchard. And he didn't come back alone. A feral dog followed him. Mottled fur, limping, one ear shredded. Behind it, 3 puppies. Skittish, trembling. When we approached, they fled. But Murphy barked softly, and they stopped. Waited. Then slowly turned and walked toward us. We named the mother storm, the puppies, Pebble, Fern, and Wisp. Murphy didn't stay in the house that night. He lay outside the rescue room door, eyes open, head on his paws, facing the orchard. The next morning, more came. 2 cats, a duck, another squirrel. It was as if the orchard had been a gathering point, a place they had remembered, and Murphy had reminded them where to go next. By the end of that week, the tally was 39. 39 rescues. And still, Murphy kept the blanket ready, not always dragging it, sometimes just laying it down and waiting. One evening, Ember came back inside carrying something small in his mouth. At first, we thought it was a stick. It was a note, handwritten. "You've made your point. We're done here." No signature, no name, just those 8 words on a folded piece of lined paper. We turned it in, of course. The sheriff's office took it seriously, but the fear we expected never showed on Murphy's face. Instead, he picked up the blanket and walked it to the center of the rescue wing, laid it down, and sat, waiting. "This is the last time I'll leave the door open at night," Todd muttered, but there wasn't any frustration in his voice, just awe. Murphy was already at the far edge of the property, standing completely still in the morning mist. The blanket had been moved again, this time laid out in the grass by the old bird bath. Around it, the circle of paw prints told a story we hadn't seen play out ourselves, but we knew the pattern by now. Someone had come. Someone had stayed. Someone had been helped. This time, it was a deer fawn. Just a baby, maybe 2 days old. Its leg was scraped, but otherwise it looked healthy. Murphy stood beside it like a shepherd, calm and motionless. The fawn didn't flinch when we approached. It stayed nestled into the blanket until Jo arrived with wildlife care. We didn't name it. We didn't need to, because we could feel it now. The shift. Not in Murphy, but in everything around him. Something had changed in the land itself. It had started with the blanket, with Murphy's instincts, but it had grown into something else entirely. It wasn't a rescue center anymore. It wasn't even a home. It was a haven. The kind of place where the wounded showed up without being called. The kind of place where silence spoke louder than words. The kind of place where a dog with no training, no badge, no title could teach an entire world what it meant to truly care. And the world had started to listen. That afternoon, a judge called. The case against the illegal operation, those responsible for the cages, the dumping, the fear, was being fast-tracked. Our home, our rescue logs, even Murphy's trail maps had all become evidence. Murphy had become a witness, not in the legal sense, but in the deeper one, a living witness to the suffering of the forgotten and to what it meant to help them. That same day, Joe brought someone new. A man named Harold, graying at the temples, eyes tired but kind. He wore a ranger's uniform and carried a small wooden box. "We found this by the quarry," he said quietly. "Buried near the largest drop zone. We thought it should come to you." Inside were collars, small ones, many faded, some with names scratched into the fabric. Murphy sniffed the box, then lay down beside it, nose resting on the lid. We held a quiet vigil that night. No speeches, no cameras, just the animals, those still recovering, those passing through, and Murphy, blanket folded beneath his chest, eyes wide in the firelight. Ember sat beside him. Biscuit, too. The rest followed, one by one. Even Button, who hadn't ventured out in days, curled up at the base of the rocking chair. It rained the next morning. Murphy waited by the door, but he didn't leave. Not that day, or the one after. For the first time in weeks, he rested. Not the light naps he'd taken between rescues, but deep, uninterrupted sleep. When he woke, he walked the house. Slowly, deliberately, visiting each animal one more time. Tinsel, now growing into her paws. Pickle, still stealing clumps of kibble. Sky, who had finally started to flap his wings again. Echo, perched on the highest shelf in the room, eyes sharper than ever. Poppy, curled up beside Acorn, and Willow, who greeted him with a soft nudge and a slow blink. He didn't drag the blanket that day. He didn't need to, because they were ready, not just to leave, but to lead. Joe arrived later that week with news. A large facility just over the county line had been turned into a wildlife transition and rehabilitation center. They had space, they had staff, and they wanted to model the program after what Murphy had done. Not just the rescues, the connections. She knelt beside him, scratched behind his ear, and whispered, "We'd like to name it after you. Murphy's Haven." He leaned into her touch, tail thumping once against the floor. The goodbyes weren't hard, because they weren't really goodbyes. Feather flew in one last time, circled overhead, and landed on the porch roof. Ember walked beside her as she took off again. Popcorn climbed into her travel crate like she was heading to summer camp. Clover stayed behind, watching, ever still, ever wise. Biscuit didn't leave at all. He remained Murphy's shadow, partner, and successor. Over the following days, one by one, they transitioned. Juniper was adopted by a family with a sunflower field. Sky joined a flight rehabilitation program. Rusty was taken in by a nature photographer who had once sworn off pets until he saw Murphy's video. Each time one left, the blanket stayed in the center of the room. Unfolded. Clean. Quiet. And Murphy? He stopped pacing. Stopped searching. Stopped signaling. He had brought them home. That night, Todd and I sat by the fire. Murphy lay at our feet, Biscuit on his right, Acorn curled between them. And I realized something. Murphy hadn't just rescued 39 animals. He'd built a legacy. A quiet, fur-covered, muddy-pawed, blanket-dragging legacy of care. He'd reminded a world full of people that listening with your heart could be louder than any alarm, that showing up, day after day, with nothing but patience and hope, could change lives. That empathy didn't require a plan, just presence. As the firelight danced on the walls, Murphy lifted his head. "And I swear, just for a moment," he smiled. The blanket was waiting. But this time not for the next rescue. It was waiting for rest. And Murphy had earned it.